Imagine a quiet Ohio suburb where behind every closed door a horrifying secret simmers. Tiffany and Matthew Lutz, once seen as ordinary parents, concealed a nightmare, a relentless cycle of abuse that claimed the life of their 5-year-old son. What if the truth was hidden in plain sight? In their desperate bid to cover up the unthinkable, every misstep and failed concealment only deepened the tragedy, until the silence was shattered by the discovery of a secret too dark to ignore. In a quiet Ohio town, the kind of place where neighbors don't even know each other's last names, a horrific story was unfolding behind closed doors. Tiffany and Matthew Lutz, appearing as just another everyday couple, were living a twisted life that would end in the unspeakable. Behind their facade of normalcy, a 5-year-old boy suffered in silence, enduring abuse so extreme it defied imagination. How could a mother and father do something so unimaginable? And why, after so many failed attempts to hide the truth, did it take a devastating discovery to expose the nightmare they'd tried to bury? In this case, the real question remains: what happened when the lies finally crumbled? And who will pay the ultimate price? It was a bitter winter in 2021. The streets of Middletown, Ohio, were silent, the kind of stillness that feels unsettling once you know what happened here. Neighbors walked their dogs, kids played outside, and life carried on. No one suspected that just behind the locked doors of Tiffany and Matthew Lutz's home, something unspeakable was happening. From the outside, their modest house looked no different from the others. But if walls could talk, they would whisper of something much darker, of secrets buried beneath layers of lies, of desperate attempts to erase the truth. How did no one see the signs? How could a house filled with such horror go unnoticed for so long? The more investigators dug into this case, the more disturbing details they uncovered. But the real question was, how much of the truth had already been erased? And were they too late? What happened inside this home would leave an entire community shaken to its core. And the worst part, the truth was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. It was just another quiet evening in Middletown, Ohio, December 2021, a town where the days passed without incident, where neighbors exchanged polite nods and children played without worry, a town where people felt safe. But safety is an illusion. At the end of a dimly lit street, inside an unremarkable house, a secret was festering, one so cruel, so deeply buried, that even those closest to the family never saw it coming. No one asked why the curtains were always drawn. No one questioned why the laughter of a 5-year-old boy had faded into silence. Then the silence broke, a single phone call, a frantic report. And within hours, authorities found themselves standing before a crime so disturbing that even the most seasoned detectives hesitated before stepping inside. What they found would haunt them forever, but the horror didn't start that night. It had been building for weeks, months. What happened inside that house? And how many chances were missed before it was too late? Keep watching, because this is only the beginning. His name was Lucas Lutz, 5 years old, a child full of energy, curiosity, and trust. Trust in the very people who were supposed to protect him. Were supposed to protect him. Those who knew Lucas described him as a quiet but bright boy. He loved dinosaurs, had an old stuffed bear he carried everywhere, and his favorite color was blue. In photos, his small frame and innocent smile gave no hint of the suffering he endured behind closed doors. Lucas should have had a lifetime ahead of him. Instead, his story ended far too soon. Tiffany and Matthew Lutz appeared. To most, As an ordinary couple, Tiffany, 31, was often seen at the local grocery store, keeping to herself. Matthew, 34, worked odd jobs and rarely spoke to neighbors. But behind their closed doors, there was a different reality, one filled with fear, neglect, and abuse. Reports would later reveal troubling details, signs of past injuries on Lucas, a history of Child Protective Services involvement, neighbors recalling strange noises, thuds in the night, muffled cries, but never enough to raise alarms. What pushed them to such brutality? Was this premeditated, or did something trigger it? And more importantly, could anyone have stopped it? Detective Rachel Monroe was among the first to arrive at the Lutz home after the emergency call. A veteran officer with 15 years on the force, she had seen darkness before, but nothing quite like this. When I stepped into that house, she later recalled, I could feel something was wrong before I even saw the body. The lead forensic examiner, Dr. Benjamin Carter, would later testify in court describing what he found as one of the most severe cases of prolonged abuse and neglect I've ever encountered. Yet, for all the horror that unfolded, one question lingers. How did it get this far? Was it a crime of desperation, or was something even more sinister at play? Keep watching, because the next discovery would change everything. It started as whispers, subtle signs no one put together until it was too late. But by the time the truth emerged, the damage had already been done. Neighbors remember it clearly. Lucas Lutz, once seen playing in the front yard, had suddenly disappeared from sight. We used to see him outside all the time, one neighbor later recalled. But then, one day, he was just gone. His absence wasn't questioned at first. Maybe he was sick. Maybe it was the cold Ohio winter keeping him indoors. But behind the closed doors of the Lutz home, something far worse was happening. It wasn't just Lucas's disappearance. There were other signs that, in hindsight, seemed obvious. A 911 call from the Lutz home. A hang-up before anyone spoke. A school inquiry when Lucas missed weeks of attendance, met with vague excuses. Bruises, scratches, and burns. Previously dismissed as childhood accidents. But no one pushed further. No one questioned the silence. Until one night, when something happened that Tiffany and Matthew Lutz could no longer hide. According to investigators, Lucas had been suffering for weeks, malnourished, bruised, his tiny body enduring unimaginable pain. But on December 18th, something changed. Neighbors reported hearing a loud thud, followed by an eerie stillness. A few hours later, Tiffany and Matthew Lutz were seen leaving the house, but Lucas wasn't with them. Where was he? This is where the story takes a chilling turn, because instead of calling for help, instead of seeking medical attention, Tiffany and Matthew did something far more sinister. They tried to cover their tracks. A frantic internet search. Terms like how to revive an unconscious child and signs of internal bleeding. A desperate attempt to conceal injuries, Lucas's body was reportedly washed, dressed, and positioned to appear as if nothing had happened. A botched alibi, the couple claimed Lucas had been sleeping for hours, but inconsistencies quickly unraveled their story. Time was running out, and with each misstep, their guilt became harder to ignore. At 8:42 a.m., an anonymous call was placed to 911. The voice on the other end was frantic, pleading. But it wasn't Tiffany. It wasn't Matthew. It was a relative. When first responders arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Inside, they found Tiffany and Matthew standing in the living room, faces pale, hands trembling. And then, In a small, darkened room, they found Lucas. The silence was deafening. His tiny frame was cold to the touch. His body bore the marks of prolonged abuse and neglect. Detectives would later say that in that moment it was clear this wasn't an accident. The moment law enforcement stepped inside the Lutz home, the walls of deception began to collapse. Tiffany claimed, "We put him to bed, and he just never woke up." Matthew insisted he was always bruised. "He's just clumsy." But the autopsy told a different story, one of starvation, blunt force trauma, and untreated injuries. And then the most damning piece of evidence surfaced. Inside Matthew's phone, detectives discovered a series of text messages, chilling, calculated, and worst of all, proof that the abuse had been ongoing for months. He won't stop crying. Maybe we went too far. But what do we do if someone finds out? This wasn't an accident. This was intentional, deliberate, and calculated. By the time detectives returned to the Lutz home, Tiffany and Matthew knew it was over. As officers placed them in handcuffs, Tiffany sobbed uncontrollably. Matthew, on the other hand, stayed eerily silent. An officer asked him. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, finally, Matthew smirked. "Guess we should have tried harder to cover it up." It was a confession without being a confession, and it was all investigators needed. Even now, after the case has been closed, after justice has been served, one haunting question remains. How did no one stop this sooner? Did Lucas try to tell someone? Were there missed warning signs? And most chilling of all, did Tiffany and Matthew Lutz think they would get away with it? As the trial loomed, new revelations emerged, ones that would shake this case even further. Because just when investigators thought they had uncovered the full truth, they realized they had only scratched the surface. And what they found next would change everything. The music fades to silence. A deep breath. Then, stay with us, because the next revelation is even darker than anyone expected. The investigation into Lucas Lutz's death quickly became a labyrinth of disturbing truths. As forensic specialists and law enforcement peeled back the layers of lies, each new discovery painted a clearer, more chilling picture of the abuse Lucas suffered. The forensic pathologist Dr. Emily Jacobs stood before the court, her report detailing a crime too horrific to ignore. Lucas's injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, Dr. Jacobs testified. Multiple contusions on the head, a fractured rib cage, and deep bruising across his abdomen. These were not accidental. They were the result of repeated, violent strikes. And that wasn't the end of it. Internal bleeding had caused severe organ damage. Signs of malnutrition were present. Lucas had been starved, his small body unable to fend for itself. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was the lack of medical care. For weeks, Lucas had suffered in silence, his injuries untreated, his cries ignored. How many days had passed before they realized he was slipping away? How many more times had he begged for help before his voice went silent forever? The investigators meticulously pieced together the timeline, but what they uncovered was a series of gaps, moments where the truth simply didn't add up. The night Lucas died, December 18th, Tiffany and Matthew Lutz's alibis began to unravel. Matthew's phone records showed a series of calls made to untraceable numbers hours after Lucas's body was found. What were they hiding? Tiffany's inconsistent statements to law enforcement contradicted evidence found at the scene. Did she even attempt to cover her tracks, or had she already resigned herself to the crime? And then there were the disturbing text messages, between the couple. Hidden conversations revealed that Matthew had been researching ways to conceal abuse months before Lucas's death. The chilling question lingered. Was this a crime of desperation or one carefully planned in secret? Dr. Mark Richards, a leading criminal psychologist, provided key insight into the minds of Tiffany and Matthew Lutz. His analysis of their behavior revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation and emotional neglect, things not immediately visible to the public eye, but present in every moment of their interactions. It's not always easy to spot, but abusers often display a lack of empathy, Dr. Richards explained. They manipulate their victims into believing they deserve the abuse, while simultaneously creating a narrative that the outside world buys into. The Lutz had done just that. For years, they managed to hide their dark reality behind a mask of normalcy. Tiffany, with her soft-spoken demeanor, had the ability to charm, while Matthew, often distant, kept his anger hidden. But under the surface, something was festering, something toxic that eventually consumed their ability to see their child as human. As the investigation continued, new evidence came to light, revealing even more haunting truths. Neighbor testimony painted a disturbing picture. They had noticed Lucas's absence, but had brushed it off, assuming it was just a phase. But what if they had acted sooner? Could the tragedy have been prevented? Social services records revealed a history of concerns with visits made to the Lutz home in the months leading up to Lucas's death. Why had these warnings gone unnoticed? As each new revelation surfaced, the question remained, could someone have intervened earlier? Now, the mystery shifts once more, because while the facts of this case are undeniably horrific, there's still room for exploration. Were Tiffany and Matthew Lutz acting alone, or was there someone else? Could someone have known what was happening and turned a blind eye? Did Tiffany and Matthew work together out of fear, or was this a calculated plan from the beginning? And even more unsettling, was there a part of the truth that will never be known? We may never fully understand the dark forces that led to Lucas's tragic death, but one thing is certain: the story doesn't end here. Take a moment and reflect. Was this a crime born out of desperation, or was it a slow, deliberate spiral into darkness? Because as unsettling as it is, this is only one piece of the puzzle. There are still unanswered questions, still threads left hanging in the air. And while the investigation may have concluded, the true depths of this case may never be fully uncovered. Just when it seemed the case of Lucas Lutz had been solved, a shocking revelation flipped everything on its head. It was during the final stages of the trial, when all the evidence had been presented, that something unexpected happened. Something that left investigators and the public stunned. An unexpected witness, someone who had remained silent throughout the investigation, came forward. Her name was Sarah, an old friend of Tiffany's, someone who had known the Lutz family for years. She had never been contacted by law enforcement. Her name had not appeared in any of the initial reports. Sarah's statement would change everything. She described a side of Tiffany and Matthew that no one had ever seen, one of increasing isolation, fear, and, most disturbingly, a series of disturbing conversations she had overheard in the months leading up to Lucas's death. I thought she was just venting, Sarah explained, her voice trembling during the interview. But looking back, I realize now there were hints. Tiffany said things like, What if Lucas doesn't make it through this, and it'll all be over soon? Then came a discovery that no one had anticipated. Tiffany's personal journal, hidden in a drawer, tucked beneath piles of old bills and receipts, was a diary that chronicled the months leading up to Lucas's death. Flipping through the pages, investigators found chilling entries that detailed Tiffany's growing frustration with Lucas, her struggles to cope with the constant demands of motherhood, but also something more sinister. "I can't do this anymore." He cries all the time. "Maybe this will be easier if he's just gone." The words were haunting, but even more disturbing was what followed. In the last pages of the diary, Tiffany had written about her plans, not just to escape the situation, but to eliminate the one thing standing in her way. Lucas. Had Tiffany been planning this for much longer than anyone realized? Or was it Matthew who pushed her into the unthinkable? But the twist didn't end there. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they uncovered something no one had ever considered. Something so unexpected, it felt like the ground beneath them was shifting. Matthew, it seemed, had been protecting someone else. Through a deep dive into his past, investigators discovered a long-forgotten connection. A half-sister named Rachel, who had been in and out of trouble with the law for years. Rachel had a criminal record with charges of child abuse and neglect that eerily mirrored the patterns seen in the Lutz case. The shocking theory emerged. Could Rachel have been involved in the abuse? Was she in the house on that fatal night? And did Matthew shield her from the blame to protect his own family's reputation? As the details piled up, Matthew's alibi, once airtight, began to unravel. He had claimed he was out at work, but forensic evidence contradicted his story. Security footage from a nearby convenience store placed him miles away from where he said he had been during the crucial hours. So, why did he lie? Was it because he knew more than he had let on? Was he protecting someone? At this point, the investigation had unearthed a disturbing web of lies, half-truths, and hidden connections. The entire case, once thought to be straightforward, had grown far more complex than anyone could have imagined. But even with all the new evidence, one question remained. Was Matthew Lutz truly the mastermind, or was there someone else pulling the strings? The music fades to an ominous hum as the screen lingers on the images of Tiffany's diary and Matthew's alibi crumbling. The tension is palpable, and the unanswered questions hang heavy in the air. A long, dramatic pause. Then, as new revelations come to light, we are forced to confront the truth. What if the darkest secrets haven't been uncovered yet? Stay with us, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about this case. As the days passed, the walls around Tiffany and Matthew Lutz began to close in. Every piece of evidence, every hidden truth that had once seemed buried, now came rushing to the surface with undeniable force. The pieces fit together, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. The climax of this investigation came not from a new piece of evidence, but from a single final witness, Rachel, Matthew's half-sister. She had remained silent throughout the trial, her existence just a faint shadow in the background. But on a cold morning, as the investigation reached its boiling point, she walked into the courtroom and gave a chilling testimony that would shift the entire narrative. I tried to stop it. Rachel's voice cracked as she took the stand, her eyes avoiding the gaze of Tiffany and Matthew. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. I thought I could fix it, but I was too late. Her words hit the courtroom like a hammer. Rachel described her interactions with both Tiffany and Matthew in the months leading up to Lucas's death. She admitted to witnessing the abuse, not once, but multiple times, and despite feeling the urgency to act, she was paralyzed by fear. But Rachel didn't just stand by. She confessed something far more terrifying. "I was there the night he died." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Every person in that room, every investigator, had been blindsided. Rachel had been in the house, watching as Lucas suffered. The magnitude of Rachel's revelation was staggering. It was a gut-wrenching turning point, not just in the trial, but in the entire investigation. As investigators pieced together Rachel's testimony, the truth was clear. Matthew and Tiffany had never been alone in this horror. Rachel spoke of how Matthew had made her complicit. He had manipulated her into thinking that Lucas's death was the only way to solve the problem. "It'll all be over," he had whispered. She now regretted every moment of silence. Rachel's statement triggered a seismic shift. Tiffany, whose earlier tears had been seen as guilt, suddenly stood in stark contrast to the shock now written across her face. She had underestimated her own sister-in-law's courage, and now the true depth of the tragedy was finally exposed. The emotional weight of Rachel's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom. But it was Tiffany's reaction that marked the turning point. She broke. Tiffany's facade crumbled as the truth of her own actions and those of Matthew hit her with brutal force. She had kept the secret for so long, believing she could control the outcome, believing that if they just waited long enough, the nightmare would be over. But now it was all crashing down around her. She collapsed in her chair, trembling, her hands clasped tightly over her face as her sobs filled the room. In that final moment, the full weight of what had been done crashed into everyone present. The death of Lucas Lutz wasn't just a product of violence. It was a slow unraveling of humanity, a series of decisions made by those closest to him that led to a devastating conclusion. How many chances had been missed to stop this? How many lives had been destroyed in the wake of Lucas's death? Those of his parents, his aunt, the community. As the emotional storm raged in the courtroom, investigators now faced their own crisis. Would they be able to stop the cycle of abuse before it happened again? And then, just when it seemed the case had reached its final act, a chilling question lingered in the air. Who else knew? Had anyone else been complicit in the silence? Was there someone who could have stepped in to end the cycle before it escalated to murder? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was clear. The echoes of this tragedy would haunt everyone involved long after the trial ended. The case of Lucas Lutz is one that will linger in the minds of everyone who encountered it. What began as a seemingly isolated tragedy turned out to be the dark culmination of years of silence, manipulation, and horrifying abuse. Tiffany and Matthew Lutz's actions led to the devastating loss of their son, a loss that could have been prevented had anyone known the truth or had the courage to speak up sooner. And yet, questions still remain unanswered. Could someone have intervened before it was too late? What drove Tiffany and Matthew to this point? Was it desperation or something far more sinister? And most disturbingly, who else knew about the horrors unfolding in that house, and why did they stay silent? These questions hang in the air, unresolved, leaving us with a haunting reminder of how easily abuse can be hidden in plain sight. But we want to hear from you. What do you think really happened? Could there have been a hidden motive we missed? Did Rachel play a bigger role in this than we realize? Drop your thoughts, theories, and questions in the comments below. Let's continue to explore the unanswered mysteries together. Because with every theory you share, we get closer to uncovering the truth. If this case shook you to the core, then you're not alone. And we're just getting started. If you haven't already, like this video, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss of the gripping true crime stories we bring to you. Each week, we delve into the darkest corners of real-life mysteries, and we need you to be a part of this journey. You'll be the first to hear the latest as we unravel the chilling stories of unsolved murders, shocking betrayals, and twisted criminal minds. And next time, we'll take you inside a case that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. A case where the truth is even darker than the lies, and the guilty may still be walking free. So hit that subscribe button now, because this mystery isn't over. Stay tuned for what's coming next.